welcome to tonight's event of the Bristol Historical and Preservation Society. So without any further ado about what, so we get into the program tonight, I introduce our Vice President for Programs, Dory Skemp.
So I think we've had a busy summer and we have a busy fall, and I'm thrilled to have Dr. David Reed here. I have heard a lot about him. I've been to a couple of his meetings that he's had on the Sowams Heritage Area Project, which is very interesting. And his group of people, the last meeting I went to, was kind of saying everybody's really around the table. They're really into the 17th century. It's not just a casual thing for all these people at this, who are involved in it. They're very much, this is what they love and what they like to do. And so it's kind of exciting to do that. So I talked to David at one point about coming here, and we've been going back and forth, and so we arranged for tonight, and he has a lot of very interesting tidbits for us, especially about how to go about and find that 17th century, which for some people has completely disappeared. For other people, they sort of bump into it if you see a house or something. But for David, and of course his group around the table, when I went to the meeting, they know the specific places that we can go and look for that particular, that 1600s, when Bristol was being settled, and what was going on in the surrounding Sowams area. So without any further ado, David Reed, Dr. David Reed.
Thank you, Dory, and thank you, Juan. Well, this is a nice opportunity to talk to people in the town of Bristol, one of 8 towns that I've been involved in for over a year. Let me just give you a little background on who I am. I live on Burrs Hill Park. That's in Warren. I live back in this corner over here. So I can see the park every morning when I get up from my bedroom window. An interesting thing happened in May a year ago. The Mashpee Wampanoag tribe showed up and began digging. Before long, over the course of a couple days, they had reburied Massasoit in the grave, near the grave where he was buried originally. And his remains will hopefully stay there for eternity. Unfortunately, they were removed in 1914 by my wife's predecessor. My wife was a librarian at the George Hale Library, and her predecessor, Charles Carr, in 1914, decided that he would remove the contents of 42 graves because the townspeople were digging them up and taking things home, and he didn't think that was a good idea, so he removed them. Well, now they're back. Well, that was just a month before I retired after 10 years working on a health project in Fall River, and then 33 years working for the Department of Mental Health. And I had some time on my hands. I do not have a history major in college. I don't have any other credentials other than an interest. And hopefully many of you here have the same, an interest in history, particularly when it's right under your own nose. So I began doing some digging, and I had recalled a presentation made by a woman at the Barrington Preservation Society named Helen Hirsch Trader. I don't know how many of you ever met her, but Helen was very interested in rediscovering Massasoit's home, the home that he and others called Sowams. And let me just show you a 4-minute video and let Helen tell her story.
It's a story still in the making of those who have gone before us, of generations living now, and of generations yet to come. But welcome to Sowams, the heartland of the Pokanoket tribe of the Wampanoag Nation and Algonquin people. Traditionally, we might start by looking at a map, yet every map has its limitations. This map was developed by Bicknell, a Barrington resident. All of modern Barrington, Warren, Bristol, parts of East Providence, Seekonk, Rehoboth, Swansea, and Somerset are part of Sowams per this interpretation. An alternative is to reflect not only on the land, but also on the water and on the sky, to reach a new appreciation of this place by looking to the natural cycles. It's been estimated that the Wampanoag peoples lost up to 90% of their population in a devastating wave of epidemics from 1617 to 1619. The Pilgrims ventured to establish their colony in the wake of this devastation. Population losses differed across indigenous populations who were not affected simultaneously or equally, creating a severe imbalance of power. In March 1621, at the time of the new year, the Massasoit Assiniboine established a peace treaty with Plymouth Colony that lasted for over 50 years. This was the very first treaty between indigenous people and the colonists of North America. Between the national myths surrounding the first Thanksgiving in 1621 and the 1675 to 1676 conflict known as King Philip's War, that long peace is missing from our national narrative of the interactions between the Wampanoag Nation and the settlers of Plymouth Colony and those of Providence Plantation. In the early 1990s, a group of amateur archaeologists began excavations on land that was then owned by the Rhode Island Country Club. Found items in the upper soil levels included a 1699 half-cent, a copper button, and a glass stopper. Lower layers revealed many stone tools, including arrowheads, knives, scrapers, drills, hammerstones, and reamers. But they also encountered something unique in Barrington and highly unusual throughout southern New England, a cluster of crescent-shaped stone hearths. In Bristol, Papa Squash is believed to be a corruption of papoose and squaw. Sowams Woods, Barrington, was a similar area set aside for women and for childbirth, a place of peace. And thanks to the work of many partners, Sowams Woods is again a place of peace, with hiking trails open to the public and fishing access to Echo Lake. The property that could best express this heritage and contribute to a rebalancing of our commemorations lacks permanent protection and has limited public access. Potuntuck, the lookout, also known as Montop or Mount Hope, although these are likely names used by settlers, is in Bristol. It includes King Philip's seat and the spring where Metacom was killed. It can be argued that Sowams is the pivotal place of cultural exchange between indigenous people and colonizing settlers in North America. Few people realize that there was a peace treaty between the Pokanoket tribe and the Puritans established around March 21st, 1621, which lasted over 50 years. One idea to consider is the establishment of a Sowams National Heritage District, which could provide a framework for an appreciation of Sowams and the role of the Pokanoket in the heritage of our country. A Sowams district could provide an encompassing approach featuring the essential cultural, natural, scenic, historic, and recreational open spaces of Sowams in a way that celebrates this layered history for residents and draws new visitors. If we begin now, we could ensure that the Sowams Heritage District is well established before the 400th anniversary of the Peace Treaty in 2021.
So that's what Helen had to tell us. He retired and they've moved to Colorado. I'm going to cast around, maybe have a little more light here. You can see this. This is the Wampanoag Treaty coin. It's a dollar coin. It's a U.S. coin. You can spend it if you want. Really the only acknowledgement by the U.S. government of that important treaty. But it was a very important treaty in that it allowed the Pilgrims to survive. Remember that almost half of them 50 of the 102 died within the first winter. And if they had not been supported and protected by the Pokanoket tribe, it's likely that none of us would be here today. That treaty lasted for half a century and guaranteed protection between both groups for each other, and meant that the Pokanoket tribe, which had been devastated by disease just before the arrival of the Pilgrims, that they would also survive. People often ask me where Sowams is. We consider it anywhere between the Taunton River and the Seekonk River. It loosely translates as the southern area. And even though the Pokanoket area is much bigger than that, going up to where the Massachusetts tribe is, and going over north of the northeast portion of Rhode Island as well. Everybody thinks that's Narragansett, but that was Pokanoket territory, and it included both of the islands. The Mashpee tribe, which you hear most about now, was down on the Cape and wasn't part of this tribe. Here we have Wampanoag, which was the English name assigned to the Pokanoket tribe after the King Philip War, because they did not want to hear the name Pokanoket uttered, and said to any person over the age of 12, if you say you're Pokanoket or speak the Pokanoket language, you can be shot. So the name changed to Wampanoag. The Massachusetts were up here, the Nipmuc up here, the Narragansett, and this portion of Rhode Island, and of course the Pequot and Mohegan. There were 31 tribes in this whole area, but they were all under Osamequin, Yellowfeather, who we now refer to as Massasoit. Massasoit simply means great chief over the many sub-chiefs. So who lived in this area? Well, lots of people over long periods of time. When the glaciers retreated about 12,000 years ago, people began moving into this area, principally because it was a great place to live, and still is, right? It's a temperate or moderate climate here. I know we've got winter coming up, but when you consider places in Maine and New York, you'd rather be here. Also, it had terrific access to water, and over the course of time, through the burning of forests, twice a year, spring and fall, they would burn the forests, not the large trees, just the underbrush. So it was like a park around here. Great for growing corn, great for hunting because you could see through the trees, and just a wonderful place to live. And everything seemed to be fine for the first 10, 12,000 years. And then, guess who arrived? Some traders, fur traders, okay, in the 1500s, began arriving on the shoreline. We know maybe some Vikings arrived even around 1000 AD, but the traders were most interested not in starting a colony here. Remember, these were just men who came over for economic purposes and traded for furs, which were very valuable in Europe at the time, particularly due to the styles, things like beaver hats. So things began at that point to shift a little bit. The people who lived here loved the fact that they could get steel and iron tools, much better than the stone tools that they had. They had access to all the trade throughout the area because they could funnel the furs down to the coast and then funnel the European goods, pottery, beads, you name it, out to the inland areas. Unfortunately, the people who came to trade also brought with them disease. Not intentionally. We have no indication that people intended to make people sick here. People didn't have a good understanding in the 1600s of what infectious disease was, but simply through contact, they brought with them diseases, and we're not entirely sure whether it was smallpox, bubonic plague, you name it. There were enough infectious diseases that would decimate the population here. Remember, the Europeans had survived many episodes of those diseases by then, and those who were immune would carry the disease but not become sick themselves. Unfortunately, the people who had been living here so successfully between 1616 and 1619 died by the thousands. It's estimated that as much as 90% of the population, particularly along the coast, died of those diseases in that 3-year period of time. So when the first group of pilgrims decided that they would not only come here to trade, but they would establish a colony and brought with them women and children, they arrived in Plymouth in December, finally, of 1620, had their own illnesses to contend with, and many of them died in the process. But by the following spring, when Massasoit decided to come and visit them in March of 1621, that's when they struck the treaty that's commemorated on the coin that you're seeing. That enabled the colonists to learn how to be successful in growing crops. We're all familiar with the story about putting fish with corn and things of that sort. But the native population supplied them with food that they would not have had otherwise. So you had a good exchange going on back and forth from the beginning. Seemed to be a very productive kind of relationship, and one that was undergirded by Massasoit Osamequin. There are two renderings. One, no one knows what it looked like. The statue on the right is at Plymouth now, and it's one that most people are familiar with, but there's a painting, a more contemporary painting by Ruth de Wild Major, that also shows him with his jacket, his red jacket, and a copper necklace. Those were two items that were found in the burial site at Burrs Hill Park in Warren by Charles Carr. So we're pretty certain, given that those two items were in the grave and had been described, that Osamequin's final resting place in 1661 was in Burrs Hill. So they struck the treaty, and from there, there's the coin that you've seen. A relationship began to develop with Edward Winslow. They became friends over time, and Winslow decided that he would come and visit Osamequin at his home here in Sowams. So he made the journey over 40 miles from Plymouth and spent time with him over several days. We got to know him. There's a wonderful account of that journey. It's spelled out in multiple pages, and I'll show you the reference to that in a moment. So he had discovered Sowams, the area that there was always a controversy in between Warren and Barrington over where Sowams was. It's on different maps, and everybody wants to know, well, where did Osamequin live? Well, the fact of the matter is that people who lived here didn't establish English homes here, didn't build permanent structures. They built structures that they could move easily with the seasons and with the availability of food and hunting grounds and things of that sort. So the idea that Massasoit would have had one house is a little far-fetched. Okay, he probably occupied dozens of places around here. But in any case, Virginia Baker decided that the spring that was active at the time of the turn of the 20th century in Warren must have been a Massasoit spring, and that's so commemorated there. And you can go see that. There's no water there. 2 years later, Winslow gets word that Massasoit is ill, He also learns that there's a Dutch trading ship that's run aground in the Sowams River. That is probably the Warren River between Warren and Barrington, right there at Tyler Point, if you're familiar with that. So he took another journey down with his friend at Hampton, and the journey is well described in Good News from New England, published in 1624. It's a great read, definitely worth it, and if you rather not read it and like to see it, go on the Sowams Heritage Area website, look at videos, and you'll find a video there that depicts that visit. Very well acted, runs about 10 minutes long, and you really get the idea of what occurred when Winslow cured Massasoit of his illness and thereby won his friendship for the remainder of his life. So people often ask, well, what was it like here before the colonists arrived? And I said, well, imagine this area pretty much erased from trees. These are shots from the Google Maps, where I've just simply taken out all the buildings and put some trees and fields in, okay? That's about as good as we can get these days. But if you understand that there were villages probably in the lower portion of Tyler Point here, there's a Dutch trading ship. This area that we now know as Warren was described after the King Philip's War as Brooks Pasture, which suggests that it was a cleared open area as well. And then many areas, including those around Bristol, were open, okay, for hunting and easy travel. There was a trading post that no one knows anything about. That's the Hoxie House from Cape Cod, but you get some idea that the first English building that was built was in 1632. That was established probably on Tyler Point because it gave access to water and the trading ships that would come in. So though we can only imagine what things looked like then, we have some descriptive information. Miles Standish, remember him? He was on board the Mayflower and led some of the military exploits there. He referred to this area, Sowams, as the Garden of the Patent. The patent meaning your territory that you've obtained from the king. And then the flower of the garden, and spelling then was a little off base, but you get the idea, flower with O-U-R or O-W-E-R. He meant, this is the best place of all. Where's Dory? If you're a realtor back then, you'd love this place, okay? It was, these wide open areas, great for planting, great for grazing your cattle and your pigs. Wonderful, okay? So he purchased some land and became a major landowner, even though he never lived in this area. In this open land, other people were attracted as well. We all remember Roger Williams, who was expelled from his church in Salem in January of 1636. Well, he knew Osamequin. He had met with him in this area prior to being expelled. He studied the language and got along very well with Native Americans. He came down to this area during that winter and asked Osamequin for help. Well, he was sick, not Osamequin, Roger was sick, and he needed some assistance there. So in the course of time, he was nursed back to health at a place called Margaret's Rock. Margaret's Rock still exists. This is what it looks like today. It's just over the Swansea line from North Warren. It's in private property, so you can't go visit it right now, but I've taken a number of groups there. The Roger Williams family goes there every other year. But in this rock, which essentially is a They call it a cave, but you can see it's just an indentation at the end of a rock, which if you put some logs up there, you could make good shelter and even have a fire in there. It's at the end of a quarter-mile long outcropping of rock that runs all across the back of the D'Alessandro farm. If you're going up Route 136, once the leaves are off the trees and you stand at the edge of the road, you can look down and you can see that rock. It's that close, about a quarter-mile from the road. And that rock kept Williams alive, along with the help of Margaret, one of the Native American women from Osamequin's winter camp. Again, you know, in the wintertime you move away from the coast into the woods, where there's more hunting, more trees for burning, etc. And we think there was a Native American encampment or settlement right near there. So that historic place still exists today, and I was just thrilled to find it. And hopefully we're going to make it a little more accessible to people with some walks as time goes on. When Roger was feeling better in April, he knew that he couldn't stay where he was in that encampment, but Osamequin had told him about a great place up on Omega Pond in East Providence. Anybody been to the Roger Williams Memorial on Roger Williams? Oh, good. Okay. Not easy to find, is it? It's a little green sign up on the telephone pole, and it's set way back in the property here. This is what it looks like from the street, and there's this little stone tablet way back that you can't read unless you walk up there. And it says, the spring is the site of the first settlement in 1636 by Roger Williams. The state of Rhode Island banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony because of its religious beliefs. He fled into the wilderness and found refuge with his friend Massasoit, from whom he received a grant of land upon which he began to build his home near this spring. Warned that he was still within the limits claimed by the Plymouth colony, he removed, left, across the river and founded a settlement which he called Providence. So that could have been Providence. It wasn't settled till much later, but that's where he was, and we have a good account of that from his descriptions. If you're on Roger Williams Avenue looking for this, you will go by one house, the Philip Walker house on the corner with Pleasant Street, and just a little bit before you get to the Roger Williams marker here on Omega Pond, you'll find the Daggett House, which is from 1690. There is a sign on it, but I know someone who's lived there and driven by there for the last 20 years, and she never knew it was there, okay? This is why we're working on helping people discover this. Well, obviously, Roger got himself over to Providence and found another spring there. The settlement is pretty much what you see here along the river at the time. There's a great salt pond here. This hillock is where the Statehouse is now. Maybe you get some orientation in that. And of course, all of this salt marsh has been since filled in and built upon, although we do preserve it with the water fire events down there. That's still the same water that was there at the time. If you haven't been to the Roger Williams Memorial, it's on North Main Street. Pretty easy to find, but very few people go there. There's a great visitor center, and if you get a chance to meet with the rangers there, they'll tell you the story. If you're really lucky, John McNiff, who is probably one of 3 of the best experts on Roger Williams, might be there, and he could tell you his whole version of what happened with Roger. I looked for more 17th century locations in Providence, thinking, well, there must be 4 or 5 buildings, a couple of other places, etc. Guess what? There's not a single building prior to 1700 in the city of Providence, not one. We've lost them all. Some have burned. Obviously, right after the King Philip War, most of them were burned, but even the ones that were built after that time have not survived. So it was a disappointment in that respect, but I kept looking. You can find some burial sites prior to 1700 in the North Burial Ground. There are a couple of other locations. One is Newtoconachet Hill. Anybody been to Newtoconachet Hill? Oh, good. 2 people. I never heard of it. I didn't know what it is. It's 290 feet above Providence. It's in the city of Providence. It's a park. We were just up there on Sunday they do a Newtoconachet Conservancy event up there every year. It's a beautiful place, wonderful trails that you can walk through. A great place, but one that even people in the neighborhood don't even know about. So we're trying to bring that to light and help people learn more about it. But back in the city proper, who knows this bridge down here? Anybody? I didn't know it. It's the Weybosset Bridge. Okay? It's not the same bridge that was there in 1680, but it's in the same place that 8 bridges have been since 1680. And guess who was the toll taker at the bridge? Roger Williams. You got to make money somehow, okay? But that bridge connected this side of the river, where the houses were, with the other side of the river, where the farms were, and where the cattle were, and where the pigs were. And you had to have a bridge to get them to the market. Market Square is on this side of the bridge. And next time you're down in Providence, I know, park your car, walk, and on this side of the bridge, there's some wonderful interpretive signs that tell you the whole story of the bridge, Roger Williams, and how that area developed. I never understood Providence until I figured out the Weybosset Bridge. It then all comes together in terms of what developed first, where things were. And if you go on the website, the Sowams Heritage website, you'll see a series of maps as that area developed over time. Speaking of maps, this is the rest of the Sowams area and the changes that took place. It's not easy to follow, and I don't expect you to read it from where you are, but starting in 1645, the first little bit of land, Wanamoisa, which is in Riverside now, was sold by Massasoit to the colonists. That was the first place that they could settle south of Rehoboth. Rehoboth was the very first land purchase, 1643. And if you are ever in East Providence, you can find the Newman Church and the Ring of the Green. If you're familiar with that, I didn't know anything about this, okay? That church is from 1643. Not the building, but the church itself. That first purchase below that area was the beginning of the colonial encroachment into the remaining Sowams territory that the Native Americans occupied, the Pokanoket tribe. So 1645, you get Wanamoisa, and then 1653, the first Sowams purchase. Okay, this land was not purchased so much to occupy. There weren't, as far as we know, there weren't any houses there initially, but the colonists were looking for salt marsh hay to feed their cattle in the wintertime. Okay? And with all the shoreline around there, anytime you go down the Wampanoag Trail and you see the Osamequin Park there and all that salt marsh around 100 Acre Cove, that was valuable land to the colonists because of the salt marsh. Native Americans weren't interested. They didn't have cattle. Who cares? Go ahead. You can have access to this, okay? And that, by the way, we talk about all these exchanges. Roger Williams started this whole idea that you don't acquire land without paying for it. And of course, in the English terminology, when you purchase land, you have sole ownership over it. But in the Native American point of view, no one owns the land. Who owns the land? God owns the land. People just use the land, so you're purchasing the use of the land. And because of that difference in point of view, we had problems. By 1667, that whole area again is now purchased as Swansea. Okay? When you go by the Swansea signs, it says 1667. That entire area was considered Swansea, and the first homes were constructed actually beginning back at about 1653. There were 18 homes, principally along the Kickamuit River in what is now Warren, pretty much over in this area as well. Notice where Bristol is down here. See, it says Wampanoag, and that's Bristol. Bristol remained Native American or Pokanoket land until the King Philip War. The next change, not purchase, that took place was separating Barrington from Swansea. They just celebrated their 350th anniversary of 1717. Okay, you familiar with that? And said, well, wait a minute, I thought Barrington didn't exist until 1770. Well, it did exist briefly, starting in 1717. Then it became Warren, and you see the strange line in 1747. I just found out from Van Edwards that said, Van, how did they come up with that line? It is the most nonsensical line I've ever seen. He said, oh, they just put a ruler on the map and drew a line. It wasn't surveyed, okay, and it makes no sense. But that was the line that was struck when we separated Warren, Bristol, and Barrington from Massachusetts. Now the Swansea line, you notice, has this little funny line over here. And then eventually in 1770, we separated Barrington and Warren. Okay, so that's, if you want to get into all the machinations of this, it takes forever to figure all this stuff out. Back to 1643, there's the Newman Church. You look closely at the little peak under the roof here, gathered in 1643. Across the street is the cemetery. You'll find some burials from prior to 1700 there. All the carpenters and if you know your East Providence history, you'll know those families. Also in East Providence, Hunts Mills. Who's been to Hunts Mills? Good, 3 or 4. The rest of you need to go there. I never heard of it. I've driven by it 1,000 times, never knew it was there. It's kind of set back from the road on Pleasant Street, and it's the location of the 10-mile river, which makes a nice loop there. And in the 1600s, the first colonists, the ones who settled in East Providence or Rehoboth at the time, began building mills along that river. The current mill is a horseshoe shape there that powered a flour mill for a number of years, and there's great interpretive signs right there at the park. It's also where the Hunt House is, which is the home of the East Providence Historical Society. So I've learned a lot about East Providence. It used to be Rehoboth, parts of which were Seekonk. Okay. I also learned about the other parts of Rehoboth, the parts that we still call Rehoboth. And if you go to the little village up there, okay, near the Carpenter Museum, a wonderful museum, great place to learn more about this area. You'll find some falls there. And I said, how long have there been falls there? Well, not these falls, but that river that's the Palmer River, was dammed up and used by people prior to 1700 for mills. We got a view from one of the sketches they have of a blockhouse from 1675. They built that because of the King Philip War. Unfortunately, there's nothing remaining just out in the woods on the side of the road, but there's a good interpretive sign that tells you about that fortified house. Well, we'll get to the King Philip War now, and that's an important piece of this. I had done a web page back 15 years or so ago on the King Philip War, And I thought, well, I knew everything there was to know about the 17th century. Well, it turns out that King Philip War, though, is a very important event. It really only occupied about 15 months, but it signaled the transition between native settlement and colonial settlement. Because after the war, the native population was either enslaved, if they weren't killed, or driven out of the area, and the colonists moved in. What town do you suppose they settled in right after the war? You're sitting in it. Okay, Bristol. Okay, there were no colonial homes in Bristol prior to 1680 because this was Native American land and it had never been sold. But after the war, the king said, "You can have the land." Okay? Not that there was ever a treaty or a sale, and that's still being disputed, and we can talk about that if you want. But that war, beginning in June 20th, not far from Child Street in Warren, we think, when Native Americans shot somebody's cow, and then one thing led to another, and the next thing you know, Philip's warriors are beginning to fire on the colonists. So colonists brought over 300 troops down to an area not far from the Miles Bridge. And there was a garrison house there that had been started by Reverend John Miles. So that was a good place to assemble troops. They came down, spent 2 or 3 days getting organized there, and eventually marched down what is now Route 136, which was an ancient trail, and came down looking for Philip here in Bristol. First at his settlement up at the Narrows. If you know where Wayposset Preserve is. Anybody been to Wayposset Preserve? Good. Okay, beautiful place. Okay, that we think the Narrows there was the location of. And we know from archaeological evidence that there was a settlement there. Then they came down to Mount Hope, thinking he might be there. He had, quote, removed and gone across the water with his warriors over to Tiverton. Thank you. Wasn't Tiverton then. And eventually went north and all the way up as far as Deerfield, burning over 50 villages. And it wasn't until a turning point in the war during the Great Swamp Massacre that the colonists thought that they were ever going to get the upper hand on it. Of course, Colonel Benjamin Church began using Native American techniques of guerrilla warfare, basically, the same that the Native Americans were using. And when the Native Americans were running out of both ammunition and food, by the following spring, things weren't looking very good for them. But it was pretty close, let me tell you. It could have been the last of the colonial settlements had they been successful. In fact, they were not, and it became the last of the Native American population here, pretty much. There's a map showing, I won't do the whole King Philip War thing, that's another lecture. You know that he was shot by John Holman, a Native American, over at Mount Hope Farm in the swamp there. But natives were enslaved, and many of them were taken down to Bermuda. And we have DNA evidence that those people were from here were taken there, and some of them have migrated back to this area. If you're ever in Swansea and want to go an old Providence Road there, you'll go across the Miles Bridge. Unfortunately, you won't see the Miles Garrison House that was burned around the turn of the 20th century, but there is a marker there. And if you can get access at Mount Hope Farm, you can still find the place, at least that people think, that King Philip was shot. Those are examples of the 17th century still around. An easier place to get to is Anawan Rock, which is up on Route 44 in Rehoboth. Anawan was his Pecassid chief who allied with Philip. He was not killed at the rock, he was captured and then eventually taken to Plymouth where he was either shot or hung. That ended the war in August of '76. So as you can see, went from June 20th to August 28th, not a very long period of time as wars go these days, huh? You can still find burial grounds around here with people who were buried prior to 1700. I mean, lots of burial grounds and lots of people buried after 1700. But looking for the ones that were, there's one burial ground over in Swansea off the Ledge Road. Rehoboth has one. This is one, the Bowen Cemetery in Warren. This is in Tyler Point. This is Serpentine Road in Warren. And this is the ancient Little Neck Cemetery that you can visit anytime you want over in East Providence, the Riverside area. And you can find the first mayor of New York, Mr. Willett, who lived there and briefly went to New York. You can also find a few farms. I've found 3, there may be more, I keep looking. Brigham Farm up in East Providence, we believe it was never, it's always been a farm, it's conservation land now. This is Byron Key in Warren, who has a family farm that he believes was started well before 1700. He even finds Native American tools on the farm property. And then my favorite is down here in Warren, North Warren, the Chase Farm. And Joetta Chase is very much interested in preserving that. These farms are having a tough time because even though they're put in preservation so no one can build on them, that doesn't guarantee that you have the income to maintain the farm. So it's tough. That farm was commissioned in 1693 by the king, okay? How do you keep a farm continuous for 400 years? Lots of natural land around here. We wish there were more, but we want to preserve and enjoy what we have. You can go to Tuisset Marsh in Tuisset in Warren. You can go over to Echo Lake in Barrington. This land here is in the Waypoisett Preserve, and this is in the middle of Barrington, along the Hampton Trail. Beautiful places. You think you were nowhere near a city when you're in them, and those places have been preserved for us to enjoy. Most of you, I'd say everyone in this room has driven on Route 136 up to 195 through Warren and Swansea, right? You go by Johnson's Market there? Okay, yeah, familiar territory, right? Well, the next time you go there, on the west side of 136, just before the Warren line, you'll see this large rock outcropping. It's kind of covered over now because of all the brush that's grown there. But that was the national grinding stone for Native American women who have worn grooves in the top of the rock up here. They're tough to find because they're filled with lichen right now, but we know that that rock was on many maps over a long period of time. Across the street, across Route 136, behind a barbed wire fence, so don't try to climb up there. And not easy to see right now with all the vegetation, but when winter comes you'll see it better. And it still has some high school spray painting marketing. But that is what's known as a balanced or perched rock. The geology people, archaeology people who I've talked to said, oh no, that's a glacial erratic. The glacier just punked that large boulder right there on that bedrock, and then the glacier managed to stick some rocks underneath it to keep it from rolling. And the glaciers do that all the time. I said, come on, give me a break. He said, well, we can't know if that rock wasn't rolled there by some high school kids in 1936. I said, yeah, lots of high school kids want to get a large boulder up onto rock. You know, I don't think so, okay? So I'm calling it a Native American ancestral structure And there are perched rocks like this all over New England. This is the best example that you can easily find around here, because the belief was that this rock essentially connected with the underworld, not hell, but the underworld, with the stars, and pointed to stars like the North Star and other stars, because the tribes were very much in touch with the celestial movement throughout the year. Okay? They didn't write about it, they didn't have books, but we know that from other tribes. Below it, other examples, I told you about Nunnacomica Hill. This is a Native American ancestral place along the trail where the four tribes, the Nipmuc, the Massachusetts, the Narragansett, and the Pokanoket would meet. I was just up there on Sunday. This, of course, is the Mount Montauk, or Potumket is the Pokanoket name of that, where King Philip would hold court. And this is behind the Town Hall and Swansea Library. And if you want to go back there, there's wonderful trails to walk through, and there's a tale that I won't recount right now about that rock and King Philip. As I told you at the beginning, you can go to Warren, and you can go to Bristol Park, and you have to go up. If you're down by the beach, you have to walk up onto the grass at the top of the hill. But there you'll find the memorial that this woman right here is Peters from the Mashpee tribe, and town officials determined a place to dig a hole and put a crypt in, and they had a celebration there. Because finally, how many of you have problems with people raiding your grandparents' graves? Huh? People go dig them up and take things home. Anybody have that problem? Well, hopefully not. Well, these folks did, okay? And they're very happy that the things that were taken out of the graves of their ancestors are back, okay? Get it? Bristol. I'll wrap up here in the last few minutes so we can have time for questions. Basically, this is the grid layout of the streets. That didn't start till 1680. You're probably much more familiar with this than I am. This is the oldest house in Bristol. Thankfully, it's still there. Maybe someday it'll be restored. But that house, what was then the Bosworth House, now the Perry-Rigo House, was where the town started meeting for their first church, which was built right where we are now. Okay, it's obviously no longer here, but that church was the first church that started Bristol and began the government of this town under a charter from the king. You can still see, if you come Saturday, 10 o'clock, we're going to be talking about some of this, but 11:30, if you want to show up just before 11:30, we'll walk up to the Congregational Church just up the street here, and we'll go into their museum, and we'll look at, this is a pew end from the original church that I just showed you, from 1684, along with some chalices that they used, some of the texts that they had, and some of their, at least the markers. I understand that there's nobody buried there. They're still in the ground up here at the, either the North Burial Ground, or I'm not sure if they removed everybody out of the town's common. But the markers are there from prior to 1700. And the last two houses here in town, you drive by these every day. They're up on Hope Street, Joseph Reynolds' house on the right, and Elm Farm on the left. Not the entire Elm Farm house, but on the back side, this portion of the house was in from about 1687, I believe. Don't quote me on the numbers there. And then close by in some of the other towns, Martin House in Barrington, the Swansea Joseph Martin House, The Hale Noon's Farm, which is on Route 136 on your way up if you're going to go look at the King's Rock. William Hunt House in Seekonk, the only pre-1700 house there. And the Kingsley House on Davis Street in Rehoboth, the only pre-1700 house in Rehoboth standing today. You also need to know that the Pokanoket tribe is alive and well. I meet with them frequently. I just spoke with the Sagamore this morning. These are the folks who've been here. Bill Sagamore William Guy is the 10th generation descended from Massasoit. So the tribe is alive and well. So I'll leave you with this wonderful painting done in 1858 by Martin Johnson Heed of the Rhode Island shore. And what you see here is a view of Mount Hope. So turn the lights on, and I'll be happy to take any questions in the remaining time. Thank you.
My understanding, Tiverton, there was a site of a Cassett swamp battle.
Yes, right, during the war.
Casino was just built. Did they find any archaeological evidence there of anything?
Not to my knowledge. For the longest time, it was really, the reason that Philip and his warriors went through that area is the colonists couldn't get through there. I mean, they knew how to get through swamps, the colonists didn't. And I think it remained that way for 100 years or more. A friend of mine, Carl Ferreira, anybody know him? He lives here in Bristol. He's grew up around there and has explored a lot back in there. But it's difficult area to get to. Yeah. Yeah?
Several years ago, there was a Martin House on Route 6 in Sowams.
Yes, still is.
Okay, that was open for visitors at one time.
It still is. It's open for visitors on Sunday afternoons during the summertime. That's the house in the upper right there. And I run another group called the 17th Century Meetup. People who love the 17th century around the Providence area, and I had a group go over there at the end of August. But you can go there, it's $5 or whatever contribution. But you know, it says 1714 or 1728, but Carl Becker, who's from the Swansea Historical, says that he's certain that there are portions of the house that were built prior to 1700. But this is why we want to do the Sowams Heritage Area. Okay, you all heard of the Blackstone Valley Heritage Area? You know, Blackstone Valley has a lot of little things that you can't find. Well, you get their map and you go find them, okay? We want to do the same thing down here. So hopefully we can convince enough people this would be great for tourism and, you know, all the businesses and restaurants, and get people to come here, but give them something to do. And exploring the 17th century, I think I think it's got a lot of sales potential on that. So we'll work on it. Your job is to take some of those brochures home with you and hand them out to your friends and tell them about it. The next 2 years is all about helping people learn the word Sowams and know that they live there, okay? So we're doing everything we can to start that first bit of awareness, and then we'll talk to the businessmen, and then we'll talk to the politicians, and maybe we'll have a national park down here sometime. So thank you very much. You've been very attentive.